Hello, everybody. You're very welcome to the Kilkenny Arts Festival 2020 here in the historic location of the Parade Tower in Kilkenny Castle. This session is part of a series that the Kilkenny Arts Festival has been running for some years now in honour of one of the greatest political essayists of the 20th century, Hubert Butler. Butler's greatness was in part because he was a genuine European for whom the continent of Europe stretched from Kilkenny all the way to Russia, and wrote with an extraordinary perspective about contemporary events as he was living them. And it's really appropriate in that context that we have with us in a talk which is partly in memory of Butler, one of the greatest political essayists of our time, who has a similar range and a similar depth, the brilliant Masha Gessen. Masha was born in Moscow, emigrated to the United States as a teenager, went back to live in what was then Russia, rather than the Soviet Union in 1991, and chronicled the aspirations of that period and also the collapse of those aspirations, the rise of Vladimir Putin, and the development of the kind of regime which of course has remained very much in place in Russia ever since. And Masha then went back to live in the United States in 2013. Masha's work is great because it weaves together a clarity of vision, an immediacy and an urgency of reporting with an extraordinary intellectual depth and an ability to illuminate the larger questions behind those very immediate events. So Masha's work has appeared in so many different publications in Russia, in the US, notably in the New York Review of Books and in the New Yorker in particular. Masha's written 10 books, I think, notably for today's conversation, The Man Without a Face, The Rise of Vladimir Putin, which is absolutely gripping account of who Putin is, where he came from, and how he took power and how he's maintained it. And also The Future is History, which is a stunning chronicle of the implosion, really, of notions of democracy in contemporary Russia. And in particular, I suppose the catalyst for today's conversation, Masha's new book, Surviving Autocracy. Masha, it's a real pleasure to talk to you. I've been reading your work for a very, very long time with enormous admiration. Maybe a place to start might be, I was just thinking back of, I spend usually about 4 months of the year in the US, and arriving in the US in January 2017, just after Trump was inaugurated, and being quite shocked from the outside to just talking to people in the liberal bubble, you know, in academia and in the media, who were much less disturbed by Trump's ascendancy than I was, and then it seemed one should be from the outside. And there was a kind of assumption that, yes, Trump is going to be horrible, but American constitutional institutions are so strong that we don't really need to worry about this. This too will pass. He can't do so much damage. You were one of the first voices, really, to write brilliantly and frighteningly the warning. You know, I think the line you used was, "Your institutions will not save you." Why did you think that at the time, and how influenced were you by your experience of watching Putin in terms of thinking about what Trump was going to be like?
Right. Thank you, Fintan, and thank you for that extremely generous introduction. I mean, Americans have a peculiar, I would say, almost religious faith in their institutions, our institutions. And by religious, I mean that we imbue the institutions of American democracy with magical qualities, the quality of self-repair and the quality of sort of perfect independent functioning. I think Americans imagine that the courts, the system of checks and balances, function independently of what is going on in society, and even independently of the people who populate them. Right? And I think it's been a shock and a very rude awakening. And we can go deeper into the origins of that kind of religious faith, and the fatal flaw of that faith that I think has a direct relationship to how we got to Donald Trump. Right? Because I think it reflects an idea of democracy as a kind of perfect structure that you build and inhabit, rather than a work in progress, rather than an aspiration, rather than a responsibility of the entire society and each individual in it. And I try to be very, very careful to answer the second part of your question. I try to be very careful about using my experience of writing about Russia, and particularly about Putin, for a quarter century, because of course we all bring our heuristics to understanding whatever we're witnessing. We have nothing else. But I don't think that Putin is the perfect prism through which to view Trump. That experience has been more useful than I would have liked it to be, and more useful than I would have expected it to be, both psychologically and intellectually, right? It's rather disturbing. I wrote a very long book about how Russian autocracy is a product of the 70-year totalitarian experiment. And here we're looking at something entirely different, but that in its key aspects looks eerily similar.
So let's just think about maybe what some of those aspects might be. A useful term, and it's one you use, is Mafia state. And it's not, you didn't invent it, but you use it brilliantly. So maybe if we just use that as a way in, just to try to think about what some of the similarities might be. What's your understanding of how we should think about a mafia state and how it works? Most people will find it relatively obvious how that might apply to contemporary Russia, but how then would it apply to Trump?
So I should say I'm very influenced by the work of a Hungarian sociologist and political theorist, Balint Magyar, who his story is extraordinary. He was a young dissident in the 1980s. Then he was a member of the liberal democratic Hungarian government in the 90s, and he's been in the opposition under Viktor Orban, and he's done some absolutely extraordinary work in the Orban era. And he, I guess it was in 2010, he published a couple of books on the mafia state, where he developed the concept. And it's funny, those books became bestsellers in Hungary. Books of political theory published by a university press became bestsellers, and I think to me that is a glimmer of hope for sort of clear thinking being so appealing that people actually go out and buy a book. And his thinking is extraordinarily clear. So his work on the mafia state suggests that there's a particular phenomenon of the post-communist mafia state that is characterized by a very personalized kind of governance. It's a clan with a patron at the center who distributes money and power. And it's important to think of it as a clan because you immediately start to understand certain dynamics that escape the view of traditional political science. Right? In traditional political science, we think in terms of elites. We always question whether elites are, but that's not what happens in a mafia. Right? There's no solidarity within the mafia. It is entirely centered around this patron, and it is entirely dependent on him because he is the only source of money and power. It's also very useful to think of the clan because of dynamics. He talks about it as a family into which you can be adopted or born, which in Putin's case, born means people that he worked with in the KGB, people that he worked with in St. Petersburg in the early 90s, are his political family, another Magyar term. Or you can be adopted later if you weren't born into it. And you can be expelled from it, you can be disowned, but you can't leave voluntarily. And that inability to leave voluntarily is another aspect that completely escapes sort of the view of traditional political science. So these are a couple of his important insights. And you see how it immediately changes the way you think about the dynamics of power. Now, Trump is a really interesting case in point. Obviously, he's not post-Soviet. On the other hand, the way he talks and the way he acts is as though he could govern as a mafia boss. He immediately comes into the White House, he brings his family, he is self-dealing openly because he apparently thinks there's nothing wrong with it. Not even enough to the point that he would make any real effort to hide, trying to get business to his hotels and golf clubs, for example, right? And yet he doesn't have a loyal mafia. So he's a mafia boss without a mafia. That does limit his power somewhat. But I think it's really important to view him through the prism of the mafia state to understand that this is the thing, or one of the very important things that are limiting his power is that he hasn't assembled the political family yet.
I think it is a brilliant way of thinking about him, precisely as you say, because it both works and doesn't work, and it allows us to think about the aspects of it that define him and the ones that don't. And in reading the book, it got me thinking a little bit about one of Trump's weaknesses, perhaps, right? Which is the successful mafia boss has some sense of loyalty to his, and it's usually a him, subordinates and that sort of patronage group. Of course, they can suffer if they fall out of favor, and they will suffer. But there's some understanding, at least within the inner circle, that there is a kind of two-way loyalty. What Trump is extraordinarily bad at is loyalty, isn't it? I mean, he expects loyalty, but it's entirely one way. So there is no sense at all that he is capable of understanding the transactional nature of the mafia state in a way that I would have thought, and you know much more about this than I do, but I would have thought Putin instinctively understands that there is a transaction going on here, whereas Trump's only transaction is really with himself and with his own interests. Does that make sense as one way of thinking about the mafia state and how it applies differently to Trump?
Absolutely. No, that's very, very interesting. In a sense, you're saying that he's an incompetent mafia. Yeah. and he is. And yet he's been in his performance, he's been very successful, right? I mean, Trump is a kind of next level performer. Obviously, a lot of power is performance. A lot of politics is performance, but with Trump, it's all performance. Right? And I think the only ways that we really have of interpreting him, and again, it's. I spend a lot of the book trying to think through language, right? But one of the problems with applying any word to Trump is that we're always applying it solely to his performance, right? It's like the debate that we've had for the last couple of months about whether to use the word fascism. And my argument has been, yes, it's time, because he is now very clearly performing fascism. Right? But I think he's doing the same thing with being a mafia boss. He performs a mafia boss. He's been performing the mafia boss since he went on reality TV. Right? And that performance is an integral part of his presidency. But because it's made for TV, it is not actually undergirded by any real transaction.
Yes. One of the things that also struck me in relation to Trump and Putin, is that the autocrat always, whether it takes the form of full-blown fascism or it's Putinism or the different forms of it, but one of the common threads is the idea of chaos. That there is a Hobbesian universe, and I am the Leviathan. I am the only figure who can bring order to this chaos, and therefore who can save you, because otherwise it's mere anarchy, and you're all going to hell in a handcart. One of the differences, and again, I'll be very interested in, I'm just posing this really, but Putin's strength is partly that there was real chaos. So it's not that Putin isn't a great answer to the chaos, but the chaos is deeply embedded on the minds of ordinary Russians. They know what the full-blown mafia war was like. So the establishment of a single mafia boss actually looks kind of good, because it brings a certain kind of order. Trump, paradoxically, and I think this speaks to your point about performance, he had to perform the chaos as well, because the chaos didn't really exist. I mean, I'm not saying everything is perfect in America, but America under Obama is not anybody's idea of a horrifically chaotic breakdown in society, right? And so, but the extraordinary thing is Trump's rhetoric. People remember the inaugural speech about American carnage, and so would it make sense to say that there's a certain kind of difference in that Putin needs to establish order and say, I am the one who brings the order out of the chaos, whereas Trump is almost the opposite. He needs to establish the chaos. He needs to keep the chaos going to maintain the sense that there is only me. And particularly as the Black Lives Matter movement has gone underway, particularly with COVID-19, he's upped this rhetoric about anarchy, the anarchy on the streets, but he needs the chaos, whereas Putin needs to be able to turn the chaos off. Does that make sense as a way of thinking about them?
I would disagree somewhat, but I mean, it's a very interesting way to into it, but I would disagree somewhat on your analysis of Putin, first of all, because part of which of the way that I think you perceive it actually testifies to the success of Putin's propaganda.
Yeah.
The 90s were, for a large majority of Russians, a time of extreme instability, and for a small minority, including people like me, right, including intellectuals, not just businessmen, a time of extraordinary opportunity. But really, by the time Putin came to power, that period of instability was over. By every indicator, Russia had entered a period of economic growth and a kind of stability. The train started running on time. The violent crime was way down. Like that, the 90s, as we imagine it, actually ended with the financial crash of 1998. Right? And there's some really good work by economists on sort of exactly what happened in the aftermath of that crash, and how Russian society was actually stabilizing in every conceivable way. Now, political opinion always trails behind sort of lived reality. But I don't even think it's so much a story of political opinion and so much a story of instability as it is a story of anxiety. Right? The instability ended, but the anxiety it produced, the knowledge that that the rug could be pulled out from under your feet, that knowledge didn't go anywhere. It was going to stay with people always. Like nothing was forever anymore. You couldn't count on anything. And that deep anxiety is what the autocrat speaks to. And I think in the United States, while Trump has trafficked in tropes that are completely, out of divorced from our current reality, such as, the trope of urban crime. Right? We hadn't even thought in America in those terms, the terms of, sort of the urban-suburban divide or the inner city crime since the 1990s. But the anxiety that he was speaking to, which I think is produced by an entirely different set of factors, that was real. And that's why that very strange, divorce from reality rhetoric has had much more traction than I think we realize. The anxiety that he's speaking to is, the single biggest event that it's related to is, of course, the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Right? That, the psychic trauma of that, for Americans in particular, the understanding that your nest egg, your shelter, but also your nest egg being sort of the family fortune, the everything that makes you part of the American dream, part of American society, that can be taken away from you in overnight. Right? That anxiety is incredibly deep, and that trauma has not been lived through. I think there are other factors as well. Economic anxiety, and I don't want this to be confused with the sort of white working class narrative of the Trumpian presidency, which I think misses the mark. Right? But economic anxiety is absolutely real, and it is absolutely real for a large majority of Americans. And social anxiety, which has a huge racist dimension, but is larger than that. That is real, and that's what he's speaking to. So, in a sense, the way that Putin invoked the Roaring '90s that had already ended, in order to tap into anxiety and make his promise of an imaginary past so appealing, is actually very similar to the way that Trump invoked the imagery of the 1990s in 2016, right? But to tap into a very 2000s anxiety.
One of the paradoxes with Trump, I think, is that, and you write brilliantly about, what's new about Trump, right? Which is this idea of somebody coming to the presidency of the United States with an explicit agenda to destroy government, to destroy those very institutions. That there have been, reactionary figures before. There have been, and you talk about them in the book. Many moments in U.S. history where human rights have been suspended, where these sort of exceptional moments have been seized on to take power. But this explicit agenda that Trump has about the destruction of government, but it's also problematic, isn't it, for Trump, which is that you take power, but then how do you use it if you're undermining the legitimacy of the very institutions that you want to occupy? One of the things I've been fascinated by with Trump is just how little he's done. That we're used to thinking about successful reactionary leaders. When they take power, they do a lot of stuff. Most of it is horrific. They kill a lot of people, but also they build motorways. They get vast numbers of people into the military. They do, they actually get stuff done. They enjoy, partly for those kind of narcissistic reasons, seeing their monuments around them, seeing all the kind of things that they can do. The strangeness of Trump, in a way, is that he is in office, but he often seems not to be in power. It seems extraordinary that for someone who thought of himself as a property developer, for example, that he didn't do big infrastructure projects in the first year of being in office, just to take a very simple thing. Why do you think that is? Why does he seem so incapable of actually exercising the power he has?
Again, I would challenge your premise a little bit, not entirely. because I think, yeah, we're used to thinking of Mussolini building roads, but I think that we underestimate the destructive part of the agenda, right? And I think Trump, in a way, he's almost a purified autocrat. He's so focused on the destruction that his accomplishments can be enumerated as the amount of destruction that he has done, and it's extraordinary. Right? But at the same time, he's also clearly cognitively extremely limited. He does not like to be in government. Peculiarly, that's actually something that he shares with Putin. Putin, I mean, I think he is over time, Putin, who is certainly temperamentally very different from Trump, he has developed a kind of story of himself and for himself, of having to carry the burden of power, because he very much believes the story that Russia would fall apart without him. Trump is much, he's been in power for much less time than Putin, and I think is probably incapable of any kind of coherent narrative, such as the one that Putin has created for himself. But you're right. I mean, his legislative achievements are almost non-existent. His biggest legislative achievement is also destructive. It was tax reform, which is essentially destroying the American tax base, and which he has just completed with his executive order signed a couple of days ago for so-called COVID relief. But I think he sees himself as creating the wall, as a kind of monument to himself, but also as an investment in infrastructure. But I think you're right. These are reflections of his of his limited ability to even instrumentalize the power that he has. But in this distilled form, what we see is somebody who's only using power to accumulate more power and more wealth. The more destruction he sows, ultimately, the more power he might accumulate. The destruction has been in the area of regulations, in destroying government itself, in destroying the system of checks and balances. And the one thing that he has done that actually is going to have a lasting impact on American politics and American life, even if we vote him out of office and he leaves, is packing the judiciary, right? Packing the courts. And that if he stays in power, or if another Trump stays in power, all of those things are actually going to contribute to consolidating power.
Yeah. You're very critical in the book and extremely interesting on the subject of journalism itself, and the difficulty that journalists face with even the use of language around Trump. I mean, brilliant on the way in which it's as if we journalists keep using terms to describe fish, when you're faced with an elephant, that the language of political journalism in particular in most Western democracies is based around certain notions of democratic norms, and then you complain about somebody not fulfilling those norms or departing from them. Do you think journalists and journalism has learned more how to deal with Trump? So it's been striking in recent months during the COVID crisis that the exposure of Trump, has been a lot more effective. Maybe a lot of it done by himself. Is it that journalists have learned how to cope with him, or is it simply that Trump has melted down and has got worse? Which of those two things do you think is contributing to the sense of Trump being increasingly exposed in the public eye?
Yeah. I don't think the journalists have gotten better, honestly. I think we continue to have the same problems as we've had for the last 3.5 years of Trump's presidency. Now, I hope that in the book I'm both critical and compassionate, because I think that some of the problems that journalists face are inevitable. I mean, it's a trap, right? It is actually not possible to solve the professional riddle of covering a lying president, and especially of covering a president who says things that don't have meaning. Right? I'll give you an example. He, for example, says, "Why don't you inject yourself with disinfectant or drink disinfectant to get rid of COVID, of the coronavirus?" And then the next day he says that he was kidding. Now, in both cases, the statement is nonsensical on the face of it. And also the president then doubles back and says, "I didn't even mean it." Right? So it's doubly meaningless. And yet we're still seeing poison center reports of people ingesting and injecting disinfectant. Right. So this is a meaningless statement, a nonsensical statement that has real life consequences because this man is president. And there really isn't a good way of covering that. There isn't a good way of covering the use of language in ways that make no sense in language, but produce consequences because of the power that is behind that use of language. So I think we have to start thinking of journalism more in terms of harm reduction. This man is doing incredible harm to this country, to this society, to this culture, to this politics. How are we going to contribute the least to the harm that he is doing? Because we can't prevent it. We can only try to mitigate it somewhat. And I think reframing the project that way can be productive. And I think there have been some examples of amazing journalism, right? Really, really inventive. My favorite example is the podcast Trump Inc., which bills itself as an open investigation into Trump's businesses. And it views Trump's businesses as a kind of way to gain insight into the nature of this administration, but also to document the damage that it's doing. What I love about it is it's very sort of low key, as the kids would say, low key revolutionary, right? It's revolutionary for a journalist to say that this is an open investigation. We don't know where we're going. We're going to be taking this journey with you. They're also they're very transparent in their sourcing. They take a lot of tips. They follow up on things that come through Twitter and email. In that, they're not unique. There's a Washington Post journalist who got a Pulitzer for his investigation of Trump's charities, David Farnthal, who does the same thing, right? He's radically transparent in his reporting, which is also a project of restoring trust in the media. Trump Inc. also has extraordinary collaborations. It's a radio station. It's ProPublica, which is a nonprofit investigative journalist company, and they do print projects. They do all sorts of things, right? So it's radically open. It's radically collaborative, and it is on an ongoing basis trying to view Trumpism as a system that it's trying to describe. That is also a radical move because rather than the New York Times, which views every event of the Trump presidency, of which there are many every day, as a kind of separate event, right? And by viewing it as a separate event, it inevitably normalizes it. This happened today. It's Thursday. It's this is the president. He was the president yesterday. He is going to be the president tomorrow. And somehow we fall into the trap of talking about this as a normal presidency. Whereas the ongoing project of defining the system, trying to describe the system, is also a project of estrangement, right? So it's that artistic lens that I think is incredibly helpful. So that's, there have been success stories, and there have been inventions that I think will be useful to us in the future, it's not surprising that a behemoth like the New York Times is much less flexible. And it is the New York Times. It can't just throw all of its institutional culture out the window, because then it will stop being the New York Times. So it has to adjust, and it can't adjust fast enough. And it has been incredibly disappointing during the pandemic. I actually don't think that it's done a great job of exposing Trump, because of the incredible number of false equivalencies. And one of my favorite or least favorite headlines is, Trump says testing no longer a problem, governors disagree, right? It's like, it's a fact. You can't have a debate about facts, and we should at least agree on that in the fourth year of the Trump presidency.
So, in the last few minutes, let's do a thought experiment and assume that Trump is defeated in November. This will probably be played back to mock both of us. But anyway, let's just say, okay, let's say Biden wins. Is there a danger that we go back to exactly where you were warning us we were at the beginning of the Trump presidency, right? Which was saying, don't worry about it. It's just a blip. The institutions will reassert themselves. And that then, if Biden wins, you get that narrative kind of returns, which is, well, it was just a blip. Yes, it was terrible time, very embarrassing. But after all, the normal world has now been restored. America's fine, and we're just back on course to where we should be. The danger of that might be that, well, there are lots of dangers, but the obvious one is ignoring exactly what you've been talking about, which is the profound damage that Trump has done. That it needs active undoing, doesn't it? It can't just be sort of shoved over to one side and say, well, that's a little interesting bit of American history, and now we can go back. So is the system capable of analyzing the damage that Trump has done, of identifying it in really specific ways, and of acting radically enough to undo that damage, so that then you can start to have maybe some kind of different narrative about what kind of future America wants? And indeed, as you point out in the book, who is the us? Who are Americans? I mean, those kind of huge conversations have to happen, but they also have to happen in a way that you're actually stopping the bleeding, and you can't stop the bleeding until you know where the blood's coming from.
Right. No, you're exactly right to ask this question in conclusion. Now, I would point out that we're doing our thought experiment is twofold. We're assuming that Biden has won, and we're assuming that Trump has left office.
Yeah.
And these are two separate events.
Yes.
So best case scenario, Biden has won and Trump has left office. And there's a real danger. It is inherent in American political culture. It is inherent in the Democratic Party, and it is inherent in Biden's personality. That we are encouraged to take a collective sigh of relief and go back to life as normal, right? An imaginary pre-Trumpian past. Now, I argue in the book that, there are two ways to think about Trump. One is to think of him as anomalous, as an alien, as coming from outer space or being brought to us by Russia, and I think that's a majority view in the sort of sane part of this country. And then there's a minority view in this part of the political spectrum, which is that Trump is just another Republican president. Yeah. I think they're both wrong. I think you actually have to think both of those thoughts at the same time in order to understand Trumpism. You have to understand that the groundwork for Trumpism was laid both by the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, especially in the last 20 years, or the 15 years before Trump ran for president, and that he is unlike any president that we've had before, or even another president who could have run on all the same forces and taken office in 2017, right? So both of those things are true. And you can't get rid of one and not address the other. My paradoxical hope is that even with those very strong forces of Biden and the party and political culture and just the desire to just be done with this nightmare, right? That even they cannot stand up to the amount of damage that he has done. I hope, paradoxically, that when President Biden comes into office, he will discover that everything is in shambles, and that it cannot actually be taken back to an imaginary pre-Trumpian normal, that it needs to be reinvented. I have some hope that a President Biden can actually lead the country in reinvention. That may be crazy. That may be just my, my recessive hopeful gene. But I think there's that possibility, that potential.
And I suppose there's the sense that there may not. There isn't really much choice, as you say. It's not. Well, it sounds very glib to give Trump any credit for anything, but the one service Trump has done is to bring to the surface, I mean, so many of these historical tensions, historical contradictions, historical anomalies. So much of the unfinished business of America really has expressed itself in this particularly horrific way. And the one thing we know is that if Trump has happened, Trump can happen again, and can happen worse. Right? So Trump has at least expanded the boundaries of the American political imagination, hasn't he? and so one either has to imagine another better, more competent, even more destructive Trump, or one has to imagine a very radical rethinking of American identity for the 21st century. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a commonplace to say that times of political crisis are also times of opportunity. And I think we have certainly seen that in the last 6 months, both because of COVID and because of Black Lives Matter, which are, of course, also related to each other. But by political opportunity, it actually means something very, very specific, which is that ideas that seem marginal, that would take decades under conditions of stability, in peacetime, to penetrate the public consciousness, become assimilated very quickly. And we saw that happen twice in the last 6 months. In March, when America was finally shocked into facing the coronavirus, the ideas of universal healthcare and universal basic income became mainstream ideas, right? Ideas that one more than the other, but both were really in the American political landscape marginal. 3 months later, with the Black Lives Matter uprising, ideas of defunding or abolishing the police, which were so marginal that most people had never heard of them, became topics of mainstream discussion, became topics of legitimate controversy. So here are 2 examples, or 3 examples of ideas that just very quickly end up right in the center of political discourse. I'm really terribly worried that the Democratic Party lacks the imagination and the skill to continue centering those ideas, right? It seems to be headed down the very same dead-end road of, centrism and pleasing donors and all sorts of stuff that actually has nothing to do with ideas and nothing to do with moral aspiration, which is something that I write a lot about in the book as essential for moving forward. And yet I'm hoping that the force of those ideas and the force of that, the opening of that opportunity is strong enough that the Biden presidency, if it comes to pass, will have to integrate them.
Well, let's end on that hopeful note. It's always a particular pleasure when someone you've admired in print turns out to be just as eloquent and illuminating and indeed mesmerizing in person as
Thank you so
Masha
much.
has been. So it's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm sure it's shared. The one problem, of course, is that if we were together here, you would be getting a standing ovation from a warm Irish public. But we'll just have to imagine it in the way that we've been imagining the future. But I'm sure I speak for all the invisible people when I thank you very, very sincerely for that really superb talk. And just to re-recommend to people, Surviving Autocracy is a brilliant, wonderfully readable book, and could not be more timely in illuminating all the questions that we're all going to be thinking about so desperately, really, over the coming months. But thanks very much indeed to Masha Gessen.
Thank you so much, Fintan. Thank you for all the kind words and such a great reading of the book. Thank you.